For a bit of context, my boyfriend and I are homeless, and we live in our car. There's a road that leads to a quiet beach on the bay near some train tracks, and there's only one road to exit that area. There's not a lot of people that come down this way unless it's for beach access, people going in to work in the industrial plants on the road, none of which were open right now, or going to an AA meeting, once again none of which were open at the time. That makes it a good area to sleep in your car without being disturbed. Nothing in the area was open except a couple of bars, and even those were a good 3 or 4 blocks away. Most of the stretch of road has 8-hour parking signs, so there are usually at least a couple other people camped out for the night, most of who we were familiar with, but tonight there weren't as many. Just a few vehicles taking advantage of the overnight parking. We'd parked a little further up the road than we normally did, hoping to get a better internet connection. It was a little after 12:30 a.m., and we were relaxing watching YouTube with the dog, starting to get a bit sleepy when we heard a car pull up behind us with their lights off. We cover our windows totally so no one can see in, but we can peek out a bit if we move the blankets. We could also see headlights from cars passing or approaching through them. My boyfriend looked out and said it was some kind of van. We didn't really think much of it and kept trying to spend some time together, annoyed with the spotty Wi-Fi connection. There were a few words exchanged on what sounded like the other side of the street, nothing from behind us where the van had pulled up. It sounded like there were 3 or 4 people talking. A bit later, the van just drove off. As it did so, we heard a knock on my side of the window, the driver's side. We shut off the volume of our laptop, then called out, "Yeah?" Silence. So we called out again, "Can we help you?" Again, there was nothing. It was then that I realized my door was unlocked, so I quickly locked it. After 30 seconds of quietness, I pulled down the cover a bit to check, and no one was there. Whatever. Sometimes there are bums walking around. Maybe they would have thought we were someone else, one of their friends perhaps. It was silent again for a while. We could see in the light of the street lamp through the crack on the sun reflector covering the front windshield, the silhouette of someone walking around the front of the car slowly. It was another solid minute after we saw the movement before we heard a quieter tapping on the passenger side window. This time, my boyfriend pulled the cover down almost right away, but we still didn't see anyone there. Right after, there was a knock on my side again. It was right about then that we realized there was still more than one person surrounding our car. There had not been time for one person to get from the passenger side to my side in between those 2 knocks, and we'd heard more than one voice prior. I started to think that maybe not everyone had gotten back inside their van before it drove off. After the 3rd knock, I pulled my window cover down almost all the way, super annoyed and on edge by now. As I did so, I could see there was a skinny white man, probably in his mid-30s, holding a flashlight and something else scooped awkwardly in the other hand. We couldn't really make it out. The windows were steamed up from us breathing inside, so it was a bit difficult to see outside. Now that I'd noticed the man though, he called out this time, "Hey, I need a jump." Interesting, since there was nothing nearby and no reason to be down here at 1 a.m. "Sorry, we were just about to take off," I said. The man got angry immediately. "Come on, I've been waiting here for hours." Okay, if he'd been there for hours, why did he not ask us to help him out 45 minutes earlier when we pulled up, parked, let our dog out to eat, etc.? And B, why had we not heard him attempt to start the car at any point? We never heard a motor rev up, no attempt to turn on the engine, or even jingling keys. Another reason that creeped me out is that I could only see him. He said I needed a jump. I have been down here for hours, but we could clearly hear that there was more than one person around, even if we couldn't see them. For one reason or another, they were out of view and not making themselves known. After this, he grumbled and went across the street to a car with white and black rims. We had seen it before, but it hadn't had a driver at the time. I got this awful feeling in my gut, and even though all the windows were steamed up, I started the car and told my boyfriend to start wiping them down so I could see. I started driving. There was something sinister about this whole situation. For one reason or another, these people were trying to get us to open a door or a window. When that didn't work, they didn't respond because they didn't have a good reason made up yet. They gave us that sob story then, hoping we would get out of the car, either so they could steal it while we were trying to help them, or they were going to rob us for the laptop, which I'm sure they could hear and see the glow of the screen. The possibilities are unsettling and endless. We drove to McDonald's to eat something and parked in the back driveway of someone we knew, so we weren't right out in the open anymore. The lock on our trunk had recently broken and was held together only with bungee cords, with most of our belongings inside. It worried me that it could make us easier targets for thieves. The next morning, we drove down there again. The white car with black rims was still there, only now the back window was busted out and the man was nowhere in sight. I'm pretty sure it was never his car to begin with. I think all those people came in the van. One of them drove off, so the rest could rob someone outright or break into parked cars on the side of the street. It was a stressful time, and my boyfriend has been rattled for days. We're nervous to park in the same spot, so we're now looking to rent a residential driveway to park at night, so we won't be so vulnerable. My boyfriend teased our dog for not barking at all, but I think it was very intuitive of him. If we needed to pretend we weren't inside the car, we would have been able to do so. I'm relieved I wasn't down there by myself. Even the two of us together were pretty nervous, but knowing we were likely outnumbered, if it were just a 120-pound female like myself in the car alone, I'm worried they may have been a bit more aggressive about getting those doors opened. Ever since I was 14 years old, I've been scared of lightning. It started when I was out on a soccer field during a thunderstorm, and lightning directly struck the fence just 100 feet away from me. The sound was deafening, and I can still remember the awful sensation of my entire body vibrating. This wouldn't be my only incident involving a lightning strike I came too close to. The next time, it would not only scare me, but also save me. When I turned 20, I moved out from my parents, who lived in the capital of my country. I moved to a small community in the south, and I had no intention of moving back. Sure, a girl that grew up in the city is used to the endless variation of restaurants, bars, stores that never close, and a city that never sleeps. I like it here, though. Despite the low population of the community and something of a sleepy town vibe to it, it's quite charming with its colorful wooden buildings, the seaside campus, and the smell of butter from the old butter factory as an eternal reminder of where you are. I can go out whenever I want, wherever I want, and meet a total of maybe 10 people. The neighborhood cats, if I'm lucky, maybe a cute lost hedgehog. There's one more reason why I appreciate living in a small town, though. It's how incredibly safe I feel here. In the city, you can barely be outside alone as a woman after 10 p.m. without feeling such discomfort that you feel compelled to check behind you once every minute. All such discomfort, however, doesn't only happen after said time or during the darkest hours of the day. It can happen at any time, but that's something you learn. Something I had to learn. I was 17 and it was the summer holidays. I was spending most of it at my then boyfriend's house. He lived with his family about 20 minutes outside the city. I lived with my parents at the time in the city center, just along the green subway line, so if I wanted to get back home, I had to take the commuter train to the central station, walk across it and switch to the green subway line, then ride a few minutes on there to get to my station. I was in one of my rebellious periods and had a month before bleached my hair. I loved it at first, but after my roots started to show, I realized my mistake. My angel of a mother had tired of my fussing over it and booked me a hairdresser so I could go back to my natural deep brown color. The day for my appointment at the hairdresser came, and I was as usual at my boyfriend's. I needed something from my parents' apartment first though, so I put on my headphones and jumped on the commuter train. I switched as usual to the green line and sat near one of the doors that I knew would line up perfectly to where I would get off. I like to crowd watch when I travel, not to stare at people or anything like that, but just observe and think about where people are going, what they do for work, maybe make up a story about them. It was a kind of game I found myself often playing on the subway or commuter train. I played that game that day. I looked around at people, and when there was one station left until my stop, my eyes stuck to a man who was sitting just a few feet in front of me. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-30s. His hair was dark and scruffy. He was wearing dark clothes and these big boots. He sat with his elbows leaning against his knees, crouching down towards the subway floor. Today, I don't remember what my analysis or fictional story was of him. I just remember he was very notable. The woman in the speaker shouted out my destination. I stood up and went to the doors and stepped off. When I got out the doors of the station, I saw it had started to rain. I pulled my big hood up and over my headphones and started to quickly walk up to the apartment, which was only a few hundred feet from the station. The apartment was an old building with a large wooden door facing the street. The door has a glass pane that runs the entire surface, and when you enter, the staircase is entirely in marble, with an old wooden elevator with an iron lattice door you have to close manually. When I got to the door, I put in the entry code and opened it. When the door swung aside to let me in, I could see something reflected in the glass. I turned around. The man from the subway was standing right behind me. At first, I was a little bit shocked he was so close to me. I assumed he was one of my neighbors or a neighbor's friend. I also assumed he was standing so close to me because it was raining and he didn't want to get wet. I said hello and opened the door while I took off my headphones. He didn't answer. When I went to the lift and pressed the button, it did not start. I turned around and saw the man standing behind me shaking. It was not the typical type of shaking that's common if you have a fever or a cold or something, but more like a spastic twitching. He stood there jerking, with his head and back curved as he had on the subway. His eyes were not on the floor this time, they were on me. He opened his mouth to talk, but only incoherent sounds came out, while the shaking and jerking became more frantic. "What's your name?" he said at last. I remembered my parents' words of wisdoms to never tell your name to a stranger, especially one whom you feel threatened by. I wanted to tell him to leave, but I felt like I was frozen, and provoking him might make the situation worse. I replied with a false name. "Do you live here?" I lied and answered I didn't. I was here to see a friend. I remember thinking I was smart at the time. Now he didn't know my name or where I lived, I thought, but he was now starting to move closer to me. He must have seen the fear in my eyes. He continued scuffling forward. I heard the elevator engine start ticking now, and signaling that it was on its way down. He told me he had been following me on the train, and that he saw me there. He knew he just had to get me. It was now that he lifted his head from his previous position, showing how tall he really was, and his shaking stopped. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." If I thought I was frozen before, that was an understatement. I was now pressed against the elevator door, and he was so close I could feel his scent. Some may think those words have to be somewhat flattering, but the way he said it, it sounded like a death sentence. He was going to do something bad to me. That was about when I heard the elevator stop on the first floor, and someone walking down the stairs to the courtyard door. That door is located on a small platform between the ground floor and the first floor stairs. You know how you can recognize and distinguish your parents' steps from others? I did this with these steps that came down the stairs, and I heard they were my father's. I quickly thought I would scream for him, but then I realized the man would know that I'd lied. He might get angry, and maybe do something to my old father. That was when my father opened the door to the courtyard, and at that exact moment, lightning struck right next to us. The sound waves of the crackling lightning pressed itself to the open door and made the whole area echo. I screamed. The man screamed. I went to my usual position regarding thunder and lightning, a fetal position on the floor. The man, on the other hand, jumped backwards and started running away. He shouted we would be seeing each other again soon. I barely realized what had happened. I went crying up in the elevator and to the apartment, where I told everything to my mother. We reported the incident to the police, and I went and dyed my hair again. It changed my appearance quite drastically. I was still a little scared after the incident, but also confused. I kept thinking about what he was saying when he ran out. We'll be seeing each other again soon. I knew at least that I absolutely did not want to see him again. However, I did not get what I wanted. A month passed by and I had practically forgotten about the situation. I was on my way to the central station to meet up with my boyfriend, who was on the commuter train on his way to me. I stood and waited for him in the hallway, between the commuter trains and the subway. In that particular hallway, a lot of people were walking, either to the trains or from them. Very few people were standing still. As I said, I stood there looking down the hallway from time to time to see if my boyfriend had come yet. That was when I saw someone else standing still. There was someone standing on the other side of the crowd, and although everyone was going in different directions and creating a kind of blurred effect around him, I could see clearly who this was. I froze just like before. He stared at me, not like my first meeting, but as if he was trying to figure out if I was who he thought I was, behind my new hair color. At that point, my boyfriend came out from the crowd and hugged me. I looked away from the man for a few seconds to hug him back, when I leaned my head against his shoulder and looked over to see if the man was still there. He had already disappeared into the crowd. I've never seen the man since, but I sometimes wonder if he's seen me. So I'm at a club with my then best friend. Near the end of the night, we're approached by a random guy who was all alone. He had a very heavy accent and told us he'd just moved here from Russia. He told us his name was Jesse. Didn't sound like a very Russian name. I was immediately on guard. This friend of mine had a tendency to pick up the worst guys though. I'm talking, in a room full of people, she will always somehow manage to pick out the single craziest guy in there and start dating him. Being as close as we were, I always managed to get sucked in too, and this night was no exception. I pulled her away from Jesse, but not before he managed to get my friend's phone number. Later, as we were in her car ready to drive home, she got a call from him. She answered, and his voice rung out on her car speaker. "Can you give me a ride home?" "No," I immediately mouthed from the passenger side. She was silent. "I live just around the corner from the club," he tried to persuade her. She reluctantly agreed and hung up. I asked her why he can't just take an Uber or walk if it's that close. It's my friend's car, and she wanted to be nice and give him a ride though. We pulled back to the front of the club and he hopped in. During this short car ride, he managed to choke out a sob story about how he moved here to start over with his 1-year-old son. His wife back in Russia had apparently died in childbirth. My friend was eating this shit up, but I started to hate him almost immediately. The next day, he's texting and calling my friend asking her out. She at least had the sense to not want to go out with him alone, asking me to come along with the guy I was dating at the time. We go to the beach and drink a few beers. Jesse takes his and wanders off alone. My guy joins him, and I see them chatting for a while. I distinctly remember him describing Jesse later that night. I like the guy. He seems a little lonely though. I was wondering why no one else could see all these red flags but me. Then again, I did always have a sort of sense for these things. The night went relatively smoothly. As the weeks go by, the four of us hang out a couple of more times. Jesse keeps trying to invite himself over to my friend's place. I begged my friend to, if nothing else, at least keep her address private. Don't let him know where she lived. Thankfully, she thought it was a smart policy. He seemed oddly fixated on going specifically to her home. As the weeks go by, he shows up with pictures of his son and even shows us a picture of his son's birth certificate. It seemed a bit overcompensating. I never met his supposed son anyway, and I had no idea where he could possibly be during all these outings Jesse was going on with us. I asked him plenty of personal questions trying to figure it out, and I think he knew I was onto him. Soon enough, my friend started dating someone else. It was an entire other story in itself. Jesse wanted to be the only guy in her life. He became possessive and made her choose, him or the other guy. Unfortunately for Jesse, she chose the other guy. He was furious. The next day, Jesse was blowing up her phone. Texts, calls, voicemails. When we finally listened to them, they were increasingly violent and full of cursing. The last voicemail revealed everything. It was all a lie. There was no son or wife. He called us idiots. The last words he said were that she'd regret it and that he would make her explode. I shudder to think of it now. She blocked him and life went on, but due to the next boyfriend being even crazier than this one, I eventually needed to take a break from this girl. We went our separate ways, and yet that nagging feeling about Jesse never went away. Jesse often popped into my head, and I got the worst eerie feeling. A while down the road, I ended up catching up with her over text. Even after falling out, she could hardly wait a few texts into reconnecting to ask me if I remembered Jesse. My blood instantly ran cold. I said yes, and she linked me to a news article. It was about a Russian man arrested for a crime while trying to flee the country. He had a very Russian name I'd never heard before. As I read the details of the crime, I was horrified. It turned out he murdered his ex-girlfriend by shooting her 5 times. I look at a photo of the suspect. Of course, it's Jesse. He got life in prison after making a plea deal to avoid the death penalty.